the title of the paper, and I think it does tie in, go away and read it, is what I will say, but it ties in with, I think, themes from the other presentations today. The core question is, what does it mean to live, what does it mean for a minority to live a full life? How should we understand this concept? And the title was inspired by an interview, actually with a Romanian-Hungarian respondent from one of the projects that I talk about. And this person, when speaking of autonomy, defined it as something that should give citizens belonging to a minority the possibility to live the same full life as those who belong to the majority. And I quote, "This meant a full life includes the ability to use our symbols and the ability to use my language in administration and governance, and about having the same chance of getting a well-paid job as any other." And so by this reasoning, effective equality for persons belonging to minorities implies the right to maintain one's own distinct societal culture within the framework of belonging to a wider state community. And this, I think, corresponds pretty closely to the original vision of NTA that was proposed by Renner and Bauer and others back in the early 1900s. It was a vision that defined minorities as communities of persons united by a commitment to maintaining a shared cultural identity. Moreover, as I think Federica, you said in the opening lecture, by my reading, they saw this shared identity as being based primarily on language. This was an ethno-linguistic understanding of identity. And the argument was then that minorities should be recognised as distinct political subjects with rights to cultural self-determination as part of a multinational conception of statehood and society. But the question I try to address in the paper is, how tenable is this vision given the diverse range of minority identities, situations and claims that exist in today's world? What are the most important conditions for maintaining a minority identity based on language, and can territory be taken out of the equation entirely? And finally, what does the actual practice tell us about the possibilities and limitations of NTA in respect of preserving these kind of identities? And in the paper, like I say, go away and read it because I don't have time to talk about it now, but I tried to address these questions through an exploratory reflection on two cases: the Hungarian autonomy established in Serbia under the 2009 law on national minority councils, and the Sami NTA arrangements in Norway, Sweden and Finland. And the work, it brings together work from two projects. The one that Federica spoke about this morning that we did in 2014 to 2018, investigating the politics of NTA in 6 countries of Central and Eastern Europe, including Serbia. And we had a particular focus on interviews exploring the perspectives and the experiences of minority political actors. And the second project is a much more recent collaboration that came out of Entan and Working Group 2 with Christina Celine McNeil from Umeå. And here we explore practices related to protection and promotion of Scottish Gaelic and Sami languages. So this isn't a project about NTA, strictly defined, but it was necessary to reflect on the Sami NTA arrangements. So this probably sounds rather strange to your ear. These are completely different cases. And I'm aware of that, but nevertheless I argue in the paper that they highlight some general questions, some general issues related to NTA and its capacity to ensure the long-term reproduction of minority languages and identities. And obviously one issue, what were the issues I talked about? Well, obviously one issue central to assessing any concept of autonomy is that of participation. So to what extent do arrangements in place give minorities a meaningful voice in decision making on matters that affect them most directly? And related to this is the question of whether an autonomy arrangement gives access to the resources necessary to sustain a distinct cultural identity. And I mean, insofar as NTA or non-territorial self-governance, as it's usually called, features in international legal documents on minority protection, it's usually found under this heading of measures to ensure effective participation. Effective participation is also the main yardstick that's used to assess NTA. If, however, we look at why NTA has been proposed or adopted in various contexts, then the central focus, I would argue, has often not been on the needs and the claims of the particular minorities themselves. The discussion's instead been driven by this kind of securitized logic, and the agenda, a normative or an instrumental agenda of decoupling the politics of people and place. So NTA has been seen primarily as some kind of catch-all alternative to territorially based claims for self-determination. And obviously, one major reason that Renner and Bauer advocated NTA in the first place was because they wanted to preserve and to reform the Habsburg state, and they saw territorially based claims for self-determination as threatening to its integrity. And we see a similar logic, obviously, in the discussions on NTA during the early 1990s, following the end of communism, and the both latent and violent conflicts over territory that occurred following the breakup of Yugoslavia and the USSR. So, there's been this tendency to cast NTA as some kind of catch-all magic solution, driven by a security perspective, and it's been that perspective rather than seeing these issues in terms of a matter of participation in democratic politics. And I basically critically engage with that in the two cases. Obviously there are the authors who question whether it's desirable, whether it's even possible to completely deterritorialise minority identities. And I think the key argument is that even if minority claims don't follow a Westphalian logic of having a sovereign state of one's own, it's impossible to completely decouple people and place in the way that Renner and Bauer envisaged, especially when you're talking about linguistic minorities that live compactly and use their language routinely in everyday life. And so Kimlicka talks about NTA as a complement rather than an alternative to territorial arrangements. And the second set of issues related to defining the boundaries of the imagined minority community that constitutes the subject of NTA, and there must be, some kind of subject. How are identity and belonging framed, and most importantly, who decides on this? And so here you see, while most NTA arrangements deem identity to be a matter of personal choice, critics contend that the model reifies and potentially hardens ethnic boundaries, and they argue that it's ill-suited to a complex social world in which individuals often have mixed backgrounds and multiple ethnic affiliations. And if you look at the practice, it shows that the political communities that are constituted through NTA arrangements are invariably internally diverse and heterogeneous. They're enmeshed in multiple and overlapping political communities of the minority of the home state, and sometimes, as in the case of the Hungarians in Serbia, in the kin state, the external kin state as well. And so there's a danger, something that Federica spoke about this morning, if NTA institutions become dominated by actors that seek to impose their own narrow agenda to the exclusion of others, and they limit internal pluralism, this can introduce lines of division that weaken the representativeness and legitimacy of the institutions, and potentially the cohesion of the overall minority community. Now, I'm not going to say any more about the cases, but perhaps I could just link, Zerin, to your last presentation and cut straight to the Salmi case, because that's where I was particularly interested in what you were saying. So in this part of the paper, I noted how, in terms of participation, the systems of Sami NTA in the three countries have often been hailed as, an example of good practice, deemed to give voice through genuine institutions of self-government, and I think they were called by one author one of the most prominent models for addressing indigenous rights questions. But from what I've read so far, and I've only scratched the surface with this, many authors would question the title of Parliament that is given to these bodies, arguing that, they have no effective legislative authority. They function primarily as consultative bodies rather than genuine organs of self-government. And I mean, one interesting issue that came out of the project was that if you look at the demography, Sami demography, then it really kind of seems to lend itself to NTA, insofar as, the overwhelming majority of those who would identify as Sami no longer live in the traditional areas of settlement, but are increasingly concentrated in the larger cities of the south. So there's territorial dispersion of a small community. And if you look at the activities of the NTAs, they have, it has enabled them to undertake and support important educational and cultural initiatives that are particularly geared to the younger generation, and trying to instill pride and interest and some kind of linguistic competence, and at the same time allowing older speakers who were fully assimilated to somehow reclaim the language. But again, speakers said, well, this was all good. One used the memorable phrase, it's probably no more than palliative care, given the endangered status of these languages. So that's one issue. But a second major one was, the extent to which the notion of Sami identity and the extent to which it is bound up with territory, because as an indigenous people, their claims have typically focused on claiming control not just over the lives of the community, but over the lands and resources that have secured its means of subsistence and its way of life as traditionally defined. I mean, this kind of underpinned the mobilisation in the late 20th century, and it was inspired and underpinned by conflicts on land use which have not gone away. And I read the article a couple of years ago by Spitzer and Selle, where they look at Norway and they say that Sami self-government is beginning to expand beyond NTA to encompass more and more elements of territorial authority, because this is so central to, that land rights are so central to the concept of identity. At the same time, they ask the question, given the demographic situation, is any further territorialisation of authority realistic? And this, brings me to the question of whether, notions of community, identity and autonomy will remain linked to place and traditional livelihood under the indigenous people's paradigm, or will it be changed, will it be widened to accommodate the needs and perspectives of speakers living dispersed and in mainly urban environments? And this question obviously has huge implications concerning the role of language policy and the function of NTA institutions, and something which I definitely don't have time to talk about, but is interesting, is that you find an interesting very similar debate going on in Scotland around Gaelic, and proposals for a so-called ethno-linguistic assembly, which would, demand more resources to meet the needs of so-called vernacular speakers, everyday speakers of the language living in the Western Isles, because the argument that's been advanced is that if nothing is done to change language policy, Gaelic will cease to exist as a living language, an everyday language within 10 years. So you see this tension between what I would call language protection, protection of a language as a societal language, and language promotion, which is a largely symbolic representation of the language. So that was just trying to pull out some of the key points and link them across. But I was struck again, Balázs, by your safe haven or window dressing, that kind of maps onto that. Are we talking about protection, or are we talking about, symbolic promotion? And obviously you can't, so as the basic message of the paper is, you cannot sort of apply NTA as a one-size-fits-all model. You've got to proceed from the particular needs and possibilities of a minority and tailor the institutions accordingly. So thank you. That was it. Yep, and we can talk at lunch if you want lunch. But,
Yes, you want to do this?
I think you should give...
Okay, if people are happy, no, don't.
Please.
Yes. I was really, I enjoyed very much the presentation. Also there are a lot of interesting things in the empirical part, but I will stick to the conceptual theoretical part. I was very much touched by your statement saying that NTA arrangements practically create political communities from minorities. I was very pleased to hear that. I don't think that often happens or happens all the time, but it's a good perspective to have in mind. Okay. And the second thing was your discussion about the limits of deterritorialization of minority issues. And that is something which I also read, and I pay attention to that. I am part in a project in which we are trying to generate case studies in the both categories, territorial autonomies and non-territorial autonomies. And we have run lately into pretty many cases where it is difficult to decide whether this is a case for territorial autonomy or non-territorial autonomy. So there are many overlaps in the empirical cases in these two perspectives. And secondly, I am, since you were talking mainly from the perspective of linguistic accommodation, I think that, yes, there are many researchers which have reached this conclusion that in terms of language protection, deterritorial approaches are not very effective. And if you need to provide effective language protection, then some sort of territoriality is required, and it is understandable because people who are using the language, they need to have a community space, a public space where the language is accepted. Okay, good. Yet I was thinking a little bit about this conclusion, saying that you were advocating, no, I don't want to say you were advocating.
I wasn't advocating, yeah.
On the fact that deterritorializing has limits. I have been thinking of the other three components of diversity. If you look at diversity management and regulation, there are four aspects which need to be addressed. One is linguistic, the second is ethnic, the third is religious, and the fourth one is legal traditions. Yes, and you might be right saying that if you have in mind accommodation of so protection of language rights, then deterritorialization has limits. But if you look at the other three, that is not so evident. You mentioned the Westphalian system. One of the core elements of the Westphalian system was exactly deterritorializing religion. And I think that this is functional, yes, it works until today. And I think that churches which are recognized by state authorities and are recognized as autonomous institutions provide an interesting example of NTA cases. And ethnic accommodation is done regularly by ethnic parties, which again is not necessarily a territorial arrangement. And legal pluralism, which is again does not require territorial. So I just wanted to raise this thing that I very much agree that in terms of linguistic policies, deterritorial is a limit, but maybe other aspects of diversity are not without chance. Okay.
Thank you. Any more?
We have questions, but for lunch.
Okay, yeah, I don't want to keep, but if I just to respond, thank you, Leventa, for that really, really fascinating and, I mean, for me, thought-provoking set of comments. I mean, the reason I chose to focus on the linguistic aspect was precisely because of the theme of the conference, and I did struggle. I struggled to, again, what it brings into focus, what's the relationship between language and identity, how core is it? And it's interesting because if you look at the Scottish debate at the moment, people have said openly this is a question of who are we? You know, who are the Scots? And the Scottish government has, you know, it has incorporated Gaelic into the nation building project. It's an official language. It's becoming increasingly visible. A lot of money is going into Gaelic medium education across the whole country. And yet, you know, and they say that Gaelic is for everyone. It's a sort of part of Scottish identity, but then you get, you know, the counter movement which says, well, you know, what does this mean in practice, that if no one actually speaks it every day, and you know, more attention needs to be given to the actual vernacular communities, and so you get this tension around, you know, and the idea that Gaelic speakers should be conceptualised as an ethnic group, as a separate, you know, community with additional rights to protect their everyday identity. But at the same, you know, that doesn't preclude simultaneously increasing the role of Gaelic in the public space more broadly, but there should be special measures for them. So yeah, I mean, you know, it goes back to this thing, is, you know, Gaelic some kind of symbolic adornment to a Scottish identity based on other criteria, or should it be, you know, a central identity building facet? So yeah, thank you. I will reflect on that when I actually write the paper properly later on. Thank you.